Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tulley, President and Executive Writing Coach at Defend and Publish, and welcome to episode 108, Your Writing Project Mix. In episode 107 last week, I talked a little bit about how I know what writing projects I'm going to work on this semester. Clients come to us all the time and say, well, during the spring semester or during the fall semester, I'm writing my dissertation. But we don't talk about all the other projects that might overlap with that. There might be a loose conference presentation out there. There might be some job documents that need to be written. Some of our senior clients, full professors, associate professors that are working on a book and then a keynote address and a grant application. All of these projects have to be juggled somehow, and there has to be some kind of a decision-making process about what kinds of writing projects will go in the time of writing or the writing time that you have available during a particular semester. So last week, I talked a little bit about how it's important to carve up writing time that matches the realities of what your semester might look like, or your quarter, or whatever academic segment of time you're working with. So for me, I mentioned I work with a fall semester, a spring semester, and a summer. I know plenty of academics that deal with their academic year in 6 segments. And so this is primarily for US-based academics that determine it this way. But how that might look would be fall semester, spring semester, and summer are all divided into 2 halves. So if we take the fall for the academic year, you might decide all the time up until a fall break is one segment, and every time after a fall break is a second segment. In the spring, it might be, the first half before a spring break, and the second half is after the spring break. And then the summer, the marker for a lot of US academics is July 4th. So the work completed before July 4th and the work completed after July 4th, because that does hit kind of in the middle of the summer. So it serves as a useful marker. I like just working with fall, spring, and summer, primarily because the fall and the spring semesters for me are 16 weeks each. And I know that's a very defined period of time. It's approximately 4 months. I know what classes I have. I know what committee meetings and responsibilities I have. And the summer, I define that a little bit more loosely, but the rules are the same. And then I take some vacation time off in there. So how I know what writing projects to do during a particular semester depends on a lot of different things, which I talked about in last week's episode. But what I'm going to talk about today is the types of writing projects to determine what your writing project mix looks like. So I'm going to go ahead. For those of you listening audio only, I am going to share a couple of slides. You can check those out in the show notes if you want to. But essentially, it just shows a variety of types of writing projects, which I'll describe that might go into your writing project mix. So when I'm trying to figure out what I'm working on during the course of a 16-week semester, there are a number of factors that could come into play. One could be, do I owe anybody anything? Do I have a deadline? Do I have a conference presentation that semester? Is there a project that I just want to get rid of because it's weighing down on me? I think about all of those kinds of things. And I also think about it in conjunction with my teaching. So I mentioned in a previous episode that my fall semester, I had a lot of extra teaching. I had more overload, and I just had a much heavier teaching load than I do in the spring. So that really dictated what kinds of projects I could work on in the fall. And in episode 105 and then in 107, I talked a little bit about my whole spring mapping process and how I figured out what it is I'm going to work on during the semester to make real writing progress in those 16 weeks. And so I talked about a couple of different projects I was looking at for me personally, but right now I want to throw out, there are 9 that I kind of use as loose categories for me to determine what I'm working on. And for me personally, this system assumes I'm always going to be working on more than one project. So sometimes that I think is difficult for academics to hear because PhD students particularly, sometimes they're working on their dissertation and then they think, well, that's all I'm working on. But that might be true in some semesters, that might not be true in other semesters. For example, if you're going on the academic job market, you're definitely not just writing a dissertation. You're probably writing cover letters and revamping your CV. For academics, once you're in a full-time position, if you're on a tenure track position, if there are any kind of scholarship requirements where you need to produce work regularly, there has to be some kind of system of how you're making sure this work is out. And some of that's determined by the projects you actually want to do, but it's also the types of projects they are. And that's where I think our discussion comes in today when we're thinking about what goes into a project mix. So for example, I'm going to talk about some different projects in here and then talk about how they might go together as a mix. So a couple of these, they're all color coded for those of you that are listening to this audio only, and the colors don't mean anything, but for those of you that are watching this visually, you'll see 9 blocks on the screen and 9 different projects. And I'm going to say what they are. So if you're listening for audio only, you're not going to need to see a screen for this. But essentially, to me, these are the projects that are common enough for academics, and they're categories of projects we can probably understand. So one of them, and I think arguably the most important for many semesters, is a completion project. So that is a writing project you actually want to get completed during the course of the semester. So for me, I try to always have a completion project in the mix. I try to always finish things. So it might be I've got like 4 or 5 outstanding projects. I might choose one of those to try to knock out this semester to get completed. But some semesters you have a writing project mix with no completion. So let's take the graduate students working on a PhD. Maybe you're in your 2nd semester of writing your dissertation. You haven't yet proposed a conference. You're not on the job market yet. Maybe your only project is your dissertation, and that's not a completion project. That's okay. You don't have to have one every single semester. And in some semesters, you might not have the bandwidth or the ability to get a project completed. But I do like to try to have at least one in there, I would say every academic year, if we're not going to make it every semester. But a completion project is one I always try to look at getting in the mix. Another one that's common and happens to me virtually every semester is some kind of a short-term project. And for me, these are things like conference presentations that don't require to have a paper written. I know many of us listening to this podcast in different disciplines. Some disciplines you have to write a paper and read and present it. Others you just make slides. I'm in a discipline where most of the work I do now, I don't have to write a formal paper. And often my conference presentations are stemming from some written work already. So what I'm talking about as a short-term project is I need to be prepared to do this presentation, whether it's making slides, a handout, drafting out my remarks, whatever the things are that I have to do. So that's one type of a short project. Another short-term project might be something like a grant application that, yes, we could make some arguments about, does this count as a writing project or not? But in my world, it does, honestly, because lots of grant work is supporting our research and writing. So maybe that's something short-term you have to do. A couple other things that show us short-term projects might be if you're applying for tenure and promotion and you're writing your tenure and promotion narratives. Those are short-term projects. They've got a finish line in sight. So certainly some writing time, some dedicated writing time has to go for those. Other things would be like a workshop that you might be putting on, or perhaps if you write a regular blog post, occasionally I will write a column for Inside Higher Education. So something like that might be a short-term project. An ongoing project, so we're on, if you've been kind of keeping up audio, we talked about a completion project, a short-term project. An ongoing project is another project that I regularly have, and it's a project that I want to keep making progress on, but I'm not trying to get it completed during the course of the semester. So it's not the same thing as a completion project. An ongoing project can become a completion project if that's the semester you're going to knock it off your plate and actually get it completed. A new project is a new project you want to start. So I do try to mix in a new project once a year, unless I'm really stacked up in my scholarly pipeline with lots of other things happening. But I do try to get a new project in there. I might say every year, every 2 years, just so I have that kind of new energy of working on a writing project. And this new project could be something I've wanted to do, or maybe some low-hanging fruit in scholarship. So PhD students, maybe there's that one article that's in your dissertation that you could probably get. The new project doesn't have to be something you are are totally, I don't know what the best word to say is about this, but you're totally excited about. Another category I have in here is like a dream project, like a project you've always wanted to do. So a project for me that I always wanted to do, and I mentioned this, I probably in one of our very earliest episodes, was a book I wrote in 2018 called How Writing Faculty Write, because I was really interested in finding out how faculty that teach writing actually write themselves. And I did it. It was a book that was formed of interviews based on how the Paris Review, a literary journal, interviews scholars about publishers and writers and authors about how they do their their publication writing. And my book was about how faculty writers do scholarly writing. So I've always wanted to do that project. And so the year that I made that a priority, I had a dream project in my writing mix. A new project, on the other hand, for me, could be something that I know I could do. It could be a low-hanging fruit article. It could be something I want to do. It's maybe not a dream project, but something I know I could do. It could be something I have data for that I just need to get moving. It's just basically a new project that's not already in the mix. A career advancement project is something that will come along occasionally, but when it comes along, it's really important. So, for example, applying for a job, applying to be an editor, maybe working through some other kind of advancement thing, like maybe documents to move into administration from teaching, revising your CV, making a professional website, deciding you're going to be on Twitter or something like that and tweet about your research. All those kinds of things I think could fall into that writing mix because it's content you have to write and create to craft your scholarly identity. So the last three projects then, so if you're keeping up with us audio, we have completion projects, short-term, ongoing, new, dream projects, career advancement. And then the last three are these. One is yucky writing projects. I have a love-hate relationship with yucky writing projects. And I wrote an article a long time ago for Inside Higher Education about getting projects completed over the summer. And I talk a little bit about this. But for right now, what these are projects that are sort of half done. You've been avoiding them. You know you should do them. You really don't want to do them. One of the things I advocate in that article for Inside Higher Ed is basically making a decision. Am I going to complete this project or not? And I have been known to walk away from projects that if I work on them and I just cannot bring myself to do them, if I don't need to do them for any reason, like other than, oh, well, I lost the time writing it, but no other fallout will happen to me, I'm willing to walk away from them. And I know some people can't afford to. If you're on a tenure track, you need every publication you could get. You might have a yucky writing project on your plate this semester. And so that's a project that is going to require maybe a little bit more willpower to get some work done. And that's why it's not in any of these other categories, because to me, it takes a special kind of energy to manage doing one of those kinds of projects. And then the last two, one is an obligation project. You could simultaneously have an obligation project and a yucky writing project. Right now, we have a client at Defend and Publish who is in that boat right now. She's about 2/3 of the way through a textbook that she hates writing. She's writing it with some other co-authors, but she doesn't want to back out. She's under contract. She's owed it to her collaborators. And for a lot of reasons, this is a project that sort of overlaps. It's a yucky project, but it's also an obligation project. Another obligation project, though, doesn't have to be yucky. It could be something you want to do, but it is a project that you promised you would do and might need to move this to a completion phase in the semester, or you might just need to get writing on it. But to me, the category of obligation is more that someone else is invested in this project other than you. So it could be something like you pitched a potential book at a conference and you haven't done anything about it. Kind of getting moving on that project would be that obligation. So it might be, well, what am I going to do about this project? I said I was going to do it. What am I going to do? This can also be things like an email you sent to some friends a couple of weeks ago, like, hey, would you like to write an edited collection with me? And then you never did anything about it. That's something that I might check into as an obligation project. So they're pretty much something that someone else is going to be affected if you don't do it. And then the last category is a little bit of an offshoot off this, but it's a collaborative project. And I don't always view collaborative projects as obligation projects, because sometimes they're not. Sometimes you might be working with a co-author and the co-author is perfectly fine if you back out. So the obligation is not there. That's not always the case, as we see with our clients at Defend and Publish, but they're not always the same thing. The reason I look at collaborative projects in different buckets is because sometimes with collaborative work, there are long spells where you're not the one in charge of doing the writing, which might mean there's extra room for another kind of project. So I kind of think of that one as a time. Or at least a way to think about time. So just as the yucky writing project requires more mental energy, the collaborative project might require, extra meetings to work with collaborators, and then long spells where you're not writing or you're not working with it. So something to look at in there. And why I'm categorizing these writing projects is that I think too often we kind of go from one project to the next, and then when we have multiple projects, we sort of drop the one we were working on, we work on the one to meet a deadline, we kind of scramble, and then it takes us a while to get reoriented back to what we're supposed to be doing. So one of the reasons for deciding what your project mix is during the course of the semester is it gives much more purpose to what it is that you're doing. And our really skilled clients who've been working with this kind of model for a while, they get really good at even mapping projects to the kind of nuances of the semester. So for example, I worked with a client last week where we talked about the projects she was going to do, and we realized that at 3 different weeks out of her 16 weeks, she was going to be very busy advising first-year students, where she was going to lose all of her writing time during those weeks. It was like 60, 70-hour work weeks. She's at a small liberal arts college. That's just the way that it was. And so one of the things that was really useful for us to think about was to think about her time. So if she could work for, say, 3 weeks or 4 weeks before one of those weeks she couldn't work at all interrupted, what a great time to slide in a short-term project. And then another one of those segments before she was going to lose a whole week of writing was to knock out a completion project. So it is a mix of the types of projects you're doing, but also completion. And I would also argue energy. So one final note about these different types of projects. Yeah, I meet with clients every so often that have something happening where they know that they're about to, lose some writing time, or, they've just got some real serious challenges. So for example, we're working with an administrator right now that's a full-time administrator that moved up from faculty and was very used to having writing time of around 12 to 15 hours a week. And they were finding very quickly that all that time is now absorbed in meetings and administrative obligations. And as a first semester administrator, we talked about the idea that maybe we're just going to have one writing project in the mix. So sometimes it can be a choice to only do one project and just that one project only. So that was one of the solutions posed. We also talked about a couple of other things where maybe saying some projects are totally off the table. So new projects are totally off the table for the first year of administration. And that comes to the second thing that I want to say is to think about what goes in your mix. So it really is about what kinds of things can you handle just in that particular 16 weeks. So time available to write is certainly important. Do you have blocks of time together? Is it fragmented? Is it less than you had last semester? How you like to work. For some faculty that we talk to at Defend and Publish and some graduate students, they only can work on one project at a time. They cannot mentally handle working on more than one. They want to devote all their energy to one. It could be because they just want to get the one completed, but it could also be that once they start thinking about a second project, then they stop working on the first project completely. And that's certainly a challenge. And then I also like to think about just very practically what's due and who do you owe, because those are stressors that are built into our academic writing time. So I want to know that on the upfront, so that way I'm not saying, oh, I have a conference presentation due in 3 days and I haven't done anything for it. I want to be cognizant of that at the very beginning of the semester. And so what I want to do to close this episode is just talk about 2 sample project mixes that I've just recently worked with clients on. In this first case that I'm showing an example on the screen with just these notes for audio listeners, but I'll tell you what's on there. So essentially, this client had 9 hours a week of writing time available. And how that writing time was broken up during the week was they had 2 3-hour blocks of time and then 6 half-hour blocks. So if that math went by too fast for you, they essentially had 2 segments totaling 6 hours of like long stretches of time. They could work in 2 3-hour blocks, but all the other time, they technically had 3 more hours in the week, but it was these 6 30-minute segments, and they were scattered all over her schedule. So what we determined for a project mix and some of the rules there was that she was going to do an ongoing project, which was dissertation work, working in the big blocks, but also in 2 of the smaller blocks that were at kind of the best times for her to get some writing done. So in this case, it was early morning, and she was focusing on completing the last chapter of her dissertation. The second part of that was then she had these 4 half-hour slots left over, and what she used those for, which was 2 hours total, was for all the little details for her job documents, because she was on the job market. And so we looked at how, she would do cover letters and CVs and kind of pay attention to the different job things as her search went on. So for example, she's kind of in the middle of the search right now, so she's already gotten some invitations for more materials, and she's already prepping for a campus visit. So that's going in those 4 half-hour slots per week. One question listeners might have about this right now is that, oh, well, if you're on the job market, 4 half-hour slots isn't going to do it. I agree. And so one of the things that happens sometimes is that sometimes more writing time is added to a week when it's really, really necessary. So for example, when I was trying to finish a book, yes, I had 10 hours of writing time in the week, but did I write more than that? Absolutely, because I dumped everything else that I could possibly do. I begged everybody to help me with my children. I, made it as much as possible. I got rid of other obligations. So sometimes it's true you're going to have more than that. But this is just what she decided to do with the 9 hours she had available. So she pretty much decided on 2 types of projects in her mix. One was her ongoing project, her dissertation. The second one was job documents, which are all individual little projects, but we just kind of called them all one category. And she knew that she'd use those 4 half-hour slots per week to do her job docs. The second project mix that I want to talk to you about as an example is somebody that has 14 hours a week of writing, and what they have is 2 hours per day. So over the course of 7 days a week, 2 hours per day. I think that I did that math right. 7 days per week, 2 hours per day. But the difference here is that some of the days there were 2 full hours in a block together. And then sometimes those 2 full hours were broken up into 2 segments where they had like a 45-minute segment and an hour and 15-minute segment. And why I'm saying that is because academic writing time, one of the things that we try to do with it is we try to find these big stretches of writing. Most academic schedules do not work that way. So some of our clients can find 1 or 2 big blocks, but after that, it's all a scramble for like a half hour or 45 minutes. So in this case, what we decided to do was to think about 3 different projects. And so what he had for this client had for his work was he had 2 conference presentations that were due both in the same semester, plus he wanted to finish completing an article. So this was somebody that was writing an article in biochemistry. And so they had done about 10 of the 25 pages. They had already conducted the research. He just wanted to get the article actually submitted and out. And so what we did for some rules here was that the completion project was worked on every day during the first hour. So on some of those days that had those like hour and 15-minute slots, that's where it was worked on. In the days where there was a 2-hour slot, that's where it was worked on. But then in all the other time available, the first presentation, which was due February 15th, was worked on. And the second one was worked on after February 15th, because that one was due April 24th. So, how that shaped out for this particular client, I know for him, it made sense to him because he knew he was making progress on his article every day. He kind of figured out, okay, well, I've got around 15 pages left to write in this article. I've got to do some references. And then we just kind of said if he worked on it an hour every day over the course of the semester, that this would be a way that he could make that article complete while still making progress on these conference presentations, which incidentally, neither conference presentation was about the content of this article. So one was about some new research that was up and one coming. The other one was about an article he had published last year. So all three of these things are really discrete projects. They're not about the same research area. They're not about the same topic. And so I think the way to think about project mix then is, if you want to think through those types of projects, just determining 2 or 3 you want to do in the course of a semester. In some semesters, you may only have 1. So the reality of academic life, though, is I'm betting that you probably have at least 2. Many have 3 or 4, just based on the way that work goes. Because as we're completing an article, we might have another article we're starting to brainstorm on, or we're starting to invent. We might have one that's sitting with a publisher and that, we're waiting to hear some revision feedback. So, obviously articles can be in a lot of different spaces. We hear about a scholarly pipeline where you should always be writing something, submitting something, have something under review. To me, this is a more complex way of thinking about the kinds of projects you're working on the end that you can control, which is during your own writing time. So what I want to switch to now to kind of conclude this episode is to talk through one of our resources from our sponsor, Textbook and Academic Authors Association. I know I talk about them on every episode because I'm so happy that they are sponsoring us. But I want to point out one resource I've talked about maybe on a past episode, but want to link to it again now, to just say that joining the Textbook and Academic Authors Association, if you're interested in doing it, I mentioned last week how cheap it is. So if you're a graduate student, it's $50 a year, and you can get $10 off with our discount code. So if you need that code again, this is in all caps, TAADP10. That can be a way that you can get a membership. But what the resource I'm pumping today is their webinars, because they have a webinar coming up in February. It's on February 22nd. On the future of textbooks. And it's really looking at augmented reality in textbooks, which is really cool because some of us in scholarly work are using this in non-textbook spaces. So I just think it's a cool topic anyway. But webinars are free for TAA members to go to, and you get a bank to all the old presentations on demand for joining. So I talked about last week why the reason I belong to the organization well before I started doing anything with them where they were sponsoring us is because, to me, this is a way to kind of get the writing content in classes and things like that in a really cheap kind of functional way. So I would encourage you to join so you can get webinar access, including to this particular webinar coming up. So hopefully these tips helped this week. And certainly if you need to brainstorm a project mix, you can always come back to me, Christine at defendandpublish.com. I'm Christine Tulley, president of Defend and Publish and executive writing coach. So I'm always happy to hear about any of your writing needs and project management concerns that you might have. Happy writing this week.